How did we get the name Apple? Steve Jobs thought it up, and God knows where it came from. He was working on orchards up in Oregon at the time.
Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20.
Woz and I had known each other since I was about 12 or 13 years old. And we built, our first project together was we built these little blue boxes to make free telephone calls.
We did a lot of demonstrations of blue boxes and convinced, we were just MCs and we were just the most incredible. We'd do jokes for an hour. And
we had the best blue box in the world. It was this all digital little blue box.
We'd get a group of 20 people in one dorm, and we'd just joke after joke. We always forced them to record it, and never once did we ever not sell a blue box the next day.
When I was in high school, Steve Wozniak and I made this little device called a TV jammer. And it was this little oscillator that would put out frequencies that would screw up the TV. And Woz would have it in his pocket, and we'd go into like a dorm at Berkeley where he was going to school, and a bunch of folks would be watching like Star Trek, and he'd screw up the TV, and somebody'd go up to fix it, and just as they had their foot off the ground, he'd turn it back on. And if they put their foot back on the ground, he'd screw up the TV again. And within 5 minutes, he'd have somebody like this.
He came to me one day and said, Nolan Bushnell has this game that he wants done called Breakout. Steve said, well, he'll pay us $700 if we give them a working breadboard. And if it's under 40 chips, they'll give us $1,000. But Steve said there's one problem. He said he had to go to Oregon in 4 days to work on some friend's farm. I think he probably had to buy into it or something, and he needed money in 4 days. We both stayed up all night long, 4 nights in a row, catch a couple of winks of sleep in the morning. That was about it. We both got mononucleosis from it. We were really stressing ourselves, but we actually did design it.
We had a fun time doing that. So when it came to building a computer together,
because we couldn't afford to buy a computer kit on the market. So we liberated some parts from Hewlett-Packard and Atari, and worked on a design for about 6 months and decided that we would build our own computer.
Woz was the brilliant hardware engineer.
Steve came along one day and he said, look, all these people are interested in schematics, but it takes them 10 hours if they know what they're doing to put one together. He said, why don't we make a PC board? A PC board, and it'll have a silkscreen legend on it telling them where every chip goes. And they'll plug the parts in, solder it together, and it will only take them a couple hours to make.
So Woz sold his HP 6 calculator, and I sold my van, and we got $1,300 together, and we paid our friend of ours, who was this PC board layout person, $1,300 to do us a layout, and decided we'd sell printed circuit boards at twice what it cost to build them, and hopefully recoup our calculator and transportation at some later date.
And I was worrying about which parts we ought to use and how we were going to build these things and how somebody that wasn't a Woz was going to manage to buy all the extra parts you still needed to buy and plug this thing together.
That's what we did, and I was out trying to peddle PC boards one day and walked into a bite shop, the first bite shop in Mountain View.
We were wondering, why are all these kits being sold? Why would you not pay the $13 and make sure everybody gets a completely assembled computer?
Paul Terrell, the then owner of the bite shop, said he would like to take 50 of these computers. And I saw dollar signs in front of my eyes. But he had one catch, which was that he wanted them fully assembled and tested, ready to go.
Now, we made a very important decision was to not offer our computer as a kit. Even though you needed to buy these extra parts, the main computer board itself came fully assembled. We were the first company in the world to do that. Everybody else was offering their little computer as a kit. And what that meant was there was maybe an order of magnitude more people who could actually buy our computer and use it than if they had to build it themselves. Woz was working for Hewlett-Packard. I was working for Atari, actually, for Nolan Bushnell.
Steve Jobs he would get jobs at Atari on and off and work as somewhere between technician and engineer, trying to get products into development and hustling things around. We
went to Atari and showed them our early prototypes, and we went to HP. And we encouraged each company to hire the other one and let us do this for them.
He became very enamored by the Atari culture of the early days, and especially the founder Nolan Bushnell.
And we got turned down in both places, probably for good reasons.
Steve said, yeah, we'll lose our money, but at least we'll have a company.
But we started a company because it was the only alternative left, not because we wanted to.
Originally there were 3 of us. One guy helped out doing our first manual, and he had 10% of the company. Steve and I each had 45%. And then if there were any disputes between Steve and I, we both trusted Ron Wayne to resolve them. We were going to sell blank PC boards at first for 40 bucks. Once we got orders and we're selling $500 completely built computers, he got worried because Steve was committing ourselves to all these huge orders of parts for thousands of dollars, and Steve and I didn't have anything.
I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with.
And he had money, so he knew that he was the only one that in the end, in this partnership, was going to get nailed. So he sold out his 10% for $800.
First face-to-face gathering of personal computer hobbyists from all around the country was this show put on in Atlantic City in 1976. Nevertheless, there were a few hundred hobbyists completely drenched walking around for hours. And we had a little tiny booth there. It was a tablecloth over a hotel table.
Steve came more from a thinking of trying to get to a product that could be sold en masse and be a part of a big market that was about to happen as a real product that you can deliver and other people can use besides just we few freaks who couldn't afford it.
And there were Woz and I and a friend or two of ours went there, and we had our few Apple ones there and a little poster we'd made. And that was really our first, the first computer show in the world.
We had to build our first Apple ones once we got this large order. And we had to buy a lot of parts. And Steve was very persuasive and talked the local part suppliers into giving us credit based on he had a purchase order that was signed by the local store.
5 days on the phone to distributors and convinced the electronics parts distributors around here to give us about $10,000 worth of parts on thin air, just on enthusiasm. So we got the parts and we built 100 computers and we sold 50 of them for cash and 29 days paid off the distributors. And that's how we got started.
And we discovered that from when we get the parts to when we get the computers delivered to the store and get our check was 10 days. And we had 30 days credit on the parts. We had 30 days to pay them off, and we ran the whole cycle in 10 days. It's amazing what you can do when you got one level of management.
A year later, I think maybe even 9 months later, there was the first West Coast Computer Fair, which was a much more professional operation in comparison with Atlantic City, but still very, very hobby-oriented compared with what goes on today.
And it got us known, even though we only sold a couple of hundred of them in a year. It got our name known, and we had a good respect for our image of ourselves nationally was good.
And the Apple II was actually the first computer to come fully assembled, where you didn't have to do anything. And the reason there was it was our observation that for every hardware hobbyist, someone who could either build the kit themselves or at least find these 5 or 10 extra parts they needed, there were 1,000 potential software hobbyists. And if they didn't have to do anything with the hardware except use it, and at that time that meant write their own programs, still there was a much larger group of people that could take advantage of this. So we wanted to reach them, and that was the real breakthrough in the Apple II.
We decided that with this Apple II might just be the makings of a big seller. We might have a product that we could sell thousands a month instead of 10 a month. And we decided we needed a company, not a partnership. Steve Jobs was doing all the marketing out of his home. He was running the whole company, doing all the scheduling, getting the parts. I was just designing stuff at night. Couldn't pay ourselves salaries. I had to moonlight from Hewlett-Packard. Steve lived with his parents. He didn't need the income. We couldn't pay ourselves salaries from the Apple I. We wanted to build 1,000 Apple IIs, but they cost $250 each to build. How do you get $250,000? You know, when you have to pay cash at your apartments. Well, it turns out that we started looking around for venture capital, and Steve checked with some friends at Atari, and they led him to one connection after another. We talked to them in the garage. We had trouble getting money. We finally ran into Mike Markkula, and he had retired at a fairly young age from Intel. He had a good stock option there. He made his $1 million, so he got out of the rat race, but he kept paying attention to electronics. One dream of his life had been computers in the home to store recipes on, of course, but it had been a dream in his life. Anyway, he looked at the Apple II, and he was going to first at least he portrayed that he was just helping us write a business plan, and he knew who to give it to get more money. He finally started realizing that the analysts were predicting a new market was going to blossom and go from zero to billions of dollars in a few-year period.
It happened for me when I saw people that could never possibly design a computer, could never possibly build a hardware kit, could never possibly assemble their own keyboards and monitors, could never even write their own software using these things. Then you knew something very big was going to happen.
You can grab a good percentage of a market and grow at the rate of the market if you do everything right in marketing terms. And he was a marketing person. So he finally wasn't going to let any venture capital get this deal. He wanted to buy in as a third partner. And he was going to have 20%, and Steve and I would each have 26%, and the rest would be divvied up to other employees. So he loaned us the $250,000, just basically in one day, just loaned it over. He trusted the product was that good. He went down with me to Intel's executive staff to show it off, and he was very proud of it.
There have been two real explosions that have propelled the industry forward. The first one really happened in 1977, and it was the spreadsheet. I remember when Dan Filestra, who ran the company that marketed the first spreadsheet, walked into my office at Apple one day and pulled out this disk from his vest pocket and said, I have this incredible new program. I call it a visual calculator, and it became VisiCalc. And that's what really propelled the Apple II to the success it achieved, more than any other single event. The Apple II could hold up to 48 kilobytes of memory, which today doesn't seem like much, but at that time was maybe 3 times as much as its competitors. And that's why VisiCalc was written for the Apple II. It was the only computer that could hold it. And so if VisiCalc had been written for some other computer, you'd be interviewing somebody else right now. And it was because of that design decision and other design decisions like it that the Apple II really beat its competition. And we had a low-cost floppy disk drive that really worked about 2 to 3 years before any of our competitors. And that was an incredibly important reason why the Apple II was successful.
11:30 at night, last night, a friend of mine, Bob Medcalf, calls me up, and he's got 3 German friends visiting from Germany, and they want to buy 20 to 30 apples a month for some god-awful, who knows what reason. And they want them in Germany, and they want to talk about buying them at 11:30 at night. And, you know, a guy in Nebraska is using an Apple computer to calculate soil samples to know what kind of fertilizer to put in the ground. It's an endless array of things that people are doing with this.
So we're getting a lot of input that people want this BASIC to be floating point. And like we're begging Woz, please, please make this floating point.
Who's we? How many people are in Apple?
Well, me. You know, Microsoft had this very popular, really good floating point BASIC that we ended up going to them and saying, help.
That was $31,000
That Apple paid you for
the floating point BASIC. And I flew out to Apple. I spent 2 days there getting the cassette. The cassette tapes were the main ways that people stored things at the time.
Because Woz and I started the company based on doing the whole banana, we weren't so good at partnering with people. And, you know, actually, the funny thing is, Microsoft's one of the few companies we were able to partner with that actually worked for both companies. And we weren't so good at that, as where Bill and Microsoft were really good at it, because they didn't make the whole thing in the early days. And they learned how to partner with people really well. And I think if Apple could have had that, a little more of that in its DNA, it would have served it extremely well. And I don't think Apple learned that until, you know, a few decades later. And I think you'll be seeing Microsoft want to work with Apple more, because Apple is the only other player in the desktop industry. So I hope we have even more cooperation in the future, because the industry wants it. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the 2 of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. Now it was like 25, when, you know, we were worth maybe $50 million. And so I went from not worrying about money, because I was pretty poor, to not worrying about money because I had a lot of money. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired.
To start a company, you have to file what's called a fictitious business name statement. We simply decided that we were going to call it Apple Computer. Someone suggested a better name by 5 o'clock that day. I like apples a lot, and partially because I took out the head of Atari in the phone book, and I used to work at Atari.